Okay, I'm going to start what I hope is the last part of neuroanatomy. I hope we get through the entire cerebral cortex as we've finally gotten here. So the cerebral cortex, we have finally gotten here. It's the most prominent part of the mammalian brain. And we have these, it consists of these cellular layers on the outer surface of those hemispheres. And we will talk about those 6 layers several times. You can look at the human in the center there, how much of our brain is this outer folded part with those sulci and gyri that really allow for more surface area. We can see that other species are not only have smaller brains, but that if we look at the manatee and the European hedgehog, I think the hedgehog has the more smooth, those smoother surfaces means there's not as much surface area where they have these 6 layers of what's doing this really kind of higher level processing. I will show a dolphin brain later in the semester though that shows their brain is pretty interestingly folded and pretty large cerebral cortex. But anyway, this constitutes a higher percentage of the brain in primates than in other species. The cerebral cortex is divided into 2 halves, these 2 cerebral hemispheres. And when we were talking about consciousness and we addressed the split brain patients, we noticed that their corpus callosum was severed. So we've talked about the corpus callosum briefly before, but it is these bundles of axons. So the communication from, so let's say some specific part of the right hemisphere to its corresponding part in the left hemisphere. We also have some communication via various commissures. I love this picture. This is diffusion tensor imaging. So this is using the MRI machine to look at the movement of water molecules. And if they're moving along in a kind of parallel path, then we know that that is an axon, or a bundle really of axons. The communication is going that way. And so the different colors are just showing that these are different areas of the brain. Again, that's when the kind of corresponding parts, communicating with the corresponding parts. But this is showing the corpus callosum, but with this nice kind of rainbow of colors. So we do have this lateralization. I know we've talked about all of these concepts before, and I'm going to go over them because this is where they are also very relevant, where the lateralization of the hemispheres, the left hemisphere and right hemisphere, each are doing really different functions. And while these are overstatements and they are really communicating what's happening typically in a typical brain, typically the left hemisphere is doing that kind of analysis, extraction of smaller elements and the serial events. So this looking at the bits in the trees for analysis. We also have our language, so pattern recognition for language, which is very detailed, and our grammar and syntax on that side. The right hemisphere is more about these kind of larger concepts, this synthesis of information. Complex objects are processed on the right side. Reading maps is something that's happening in the right hemisphere. And again, this is really what's typical. It's a bit overstated. Obviously, when we're reading a map, we're using both hemispheres of our brain. It's just that the right hemisphere is taking a large part of that aspect of reading a map. We have contralaterality. As I've mentioned, we're going across. We're crossing from the right hand, feeling my couch right now, to the left hemisphere. So the left somatosensory cortex is processing what's happening in my right hand. My motor control, when I'm waving my right hand, that's happening in the left motor cortex, and vision as well. If what's in the right visual field is going to the left hemisphere. I have gone through those now a number of times. As I keep saying, it's complicated for hearing. I like to ignore it at this point. For the most part, it does go contralaterally, but some of that information goes up ipsilaterally as well, as we actually need to put that information together into those subcortical structures for locating where sounds are coming from. So it's a bit complicated. And then we have ipsilaterality, so everything moving along the same hemisphere for taste and olfaction. And again, we saw this with the split brain people, that they were smelling the rose with their right nostril, their right hemisphere was having that experience. Their left hemisphere, because their corpus callosum was severed, was unaware of that experience. The four lobes of the cerebral cortex. So remember, this is in each hemisphere. This is sometimes referred to as the neocortex, the newer cortex. That's talking about evolutionarily newer. I move up from the back to the front because the frontal lobe is, so the cerebral cortex is the fun part, and the frontal lobe is the funnest part of the fun part for me. We're going to start back with the occipital lobe, talking about vision, the primary visual cortex. That visual information is going to move up from there towards the frontal lobes. It's going to go through the temporal lobes and parietal lobes. The temporal lobe, so if we go ventrally from the occipital lobe, but anterior forward, we have the temporal lobes where our primary auditory cortex is, so our sense of hearing exists there, or that's the first higher level processing of sounds we hear. As we move forward and dorsally, so up through the parietal lobes, we get to that primary somatosensory cortex up there where we have the skin senses, or where I'm sensory, feeling, feeling my body, okay, both not just touch, but itch, tickle, pain, all of that. When we move forward into the frontal lobes, we will see how the primary somatosensory cortex is really right up against that motor cortex. So it makes sense that what I'm feeling with my body is going to influence and want to communicate very quickly with how I move my body. And then we move up into the prefrontal cortex, which again is really what makes us unique as humans, and is probably the funnest part of the brain to talk about. So now I've given all of this information about the occipital lobe before, but here it is on a summary slide that includes pretty much what we want to know about the occipital lobe at this point. So it's at the posterior end of the cortex. It's back at the back of the cortex. It includes the primary visual cortex. When we talk about that, it's going to be referred to as V1, striate cortex. It has this striped appearance. Those are just names that people use. When we have damage to it, we get that cortical blindness or blind sight that, again, we talked about now when we discussed consciousness, that they seem to be, some people might say they are unconscious of things that they can interact with because they're denying that they see. They don't seem to have any conscious experience of what they are, what's hitting, so the part of the visual field that is getting to that part of the damaged part of the primary visual cortex. The eyes get the stimulus. They give us our sensation of sight. They're going to change that stimulus into something the brain can understand. But if we don't give that information to the visual cortex, then we don't really consider that having a meaningful conscious experience of information. It doesn't matter how well my eyes work if I don't get that information to the cortex. Okay, so here I move up dorsally first, up to the parietal lobes, really between the occipital lobe and the central sulcus, so that groove towards that they say is towards the center of the brain, but our frontal lobes are always a little bit larger than I think they are. They go back pretty far, but it really depends on the particular brain. It is that post-central gyrus, so that outfolding, that is the primary somatosensory cortex. It is receiving sensations from touch receptors, muscle stretch receptors, and joint receptors, and it is representing the body in those layers of the cortex 4 times. What we see there is this homunculus that where I am being touched, or wherever I am stretching my muscles, that is going to, if I'm feeling something with my hands and fingers, we can see that kind of up pretty dorsally, and then pretty medial as well. And then we're getting into that fold that is in the center of where the cerebral cortex, the two hemispheres are going to communicate, where I'm feeling my legs, my toes, and my genitals. And I meant to do this with the previous slide, so if you notice, if you want to go back for a second and after I say this and notice that the primary somatosensory cortex, that homunculus, that body map, and the next to it is the motor homunculus, the body map for moving the body, and they are pretty well lined up. They're not completely lined up, but they're pretty well lined up with each other because we want to be able to very efficiently use this information about what's touching my body, information about my body, in order to help control my movements. Because what we're doing is we're going to take that visual information and put it together with information about my body. Part of what the parietal lobes are doing includes this attention to space so that we can navigate throughout our worlds. So when we look at right parietal damage, we have this hemi-neglect or unilateral neglect. I can't remember which one I used before when we discussed it in the consciousness slides, but people go back and forth between those, and so do I. But that hemi-neglect of the left side. So here's that same picture of a flower that is missing the left side petals. If you look at, I think this is the picture in your book. It's in a lot of textbooks of some of these people with hemi-neglect drawing a clock. They'll draw the whole circle, but when they're putting in the numbers, they either just do 1 through 6 and stop, or they do this thing where 1, 2, 3, and 4 are kind of spaced evenly where they're supposed to be spaced, and then 5 through 12, maybe even 4 through 12, they're all smooshed together so that they stay on the right side, and that left side is just left bare. There's been one study where they had people imagine themselves at the north side of this plaza in Italy and ask them to describe the plaza. They would describe what was to the west, and then they had the person, well, now imagine yourself on the south side of the plaza, and when they imagined themselves on the south side, they described what was to the right. And as we said when we talked about this before with consciousness, this really has to do with attention, which influences perception, but it's not about perception itself, because if we can draw their attention specifically to something on the left, they can perceive it. It's just that if we don't pay attention to something, we don't usually have a conscious perceptual experience of that. Left parietal damage is different in humans, and it usually ends out being, it depends on the damage, where exactly it is and how severe it is. But usually what we see is this inability to understand language about the body or space. So I think I've given these examples before, but I'm not sure, so I'm giving them again. So in one of the women who has left parietal damage, they tell her to point to her left shoulder, and she points somewhere down, like to her left elbow or something. So this how exactly language is working is to describe their body. They get confused about that. Depending on the damage, we also see potentially some problems with dealing with numbers, because the parietal lobe is also essential for understanding numerical information. So now we're ventral to the parietal lobes, but we're the lateral portion of each hemisphere. So in the temporal lobes, they're really named for being near the temples, so right there at the temples. And as I said with the original slide of just the 4 lobes, the temporal lobes include the primary auditory cortex. So this is where we are getting our first cortical experience of sound. It is involved in language comprehension and higher level aspects of vision, like perception of movement, face recognition, recognition of objects, and really to a large extent, the language comprehension is in the left temporal lobe. Those more complex recognizing objects and faces are really in the right temporal lobes. And again, overstatements, but that's generally where that information lies, or the processing of that information. I think it's good to put in here that we have these sensory association cortices as we are closest to that primary receiving area, where the primary receiving area is the first region of the cortex that is receiving whatever sensory information we're talking about. As we get just outside of that, we're still just getting information from that sensory system. But as we get farther from the primary receiving area, we want to put that information together. I keep talking about how we want to put our body information together with our visual information so that we can figure out how to navigate in the world, whether or not I want to pick up this cup and where I need to put my hands and how I need to reach and all of that. I need to put that information together. So those sensory association cortices that are farther from the primary receiving area, they are receiving information from more than one sensory system. All right, so the frontal lobes. From the central sulcus now to the anterior limit of the brain is the frontal lobe. That precentral gyrus is the primary motor cortex. Remember the post-central, so behind that, the gyrus behind that central sulcus was the primary somatosensory cortex. And so we're showing this again, where the homunculus that is closest to the brain in this picture is the somatosensory cortex, and the one next to that, B, is marked the motor cortex. And we can see that they line up pretty well. In front of that motor cortex, we have the premotor cortex, which is our motor association. So one of those, instead of a sensory association cortex, it's the motor association cortex. Okay, as we move forward from those motor cortices to the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex is really our higher cognitive functions. I called it before the CEO of the brain, the decision maker. When we are making plans, thinking about our future, and working to follow those plans, regulating impulses and emotions so that we can think about those plans. Language production, Broca's area, as moving up from those motor cortex and the association, those motor associative regions. The language production is right there, really in between. So part of the prefrontal cortex and part of the motor associative areas. That prefrontal cortex does all of these things. So it gives us our working memory, our social awareness, our emotional expressions, and our somatic markers, where some of this is being able to consider other people, thinking about emotions and how to put language on those emotions so that we can have empathy for other people. The somatic markers, that's a body marker. When you talk about something like I have this gut feeling, or I have this feeling of guilt that sometimes we talk about as feeling in the body, that's of course really coming from the brain. That is the prefrontal cortex that is giving us that. And then the picture to the bottom right, you can see that, so I mentioned how the cerebral cortex is larger in primates than in other animals, the proportion of the brain, and now we get to this prefrontal cortex, and you can see that for humans, this prefrontal cortex is a larger proportion of the cerebral cortex than for other animals. We are really doing a lot more of this kind of thinking of the future, planning, considering other people, feeling guilty and working from, so I don't want to do that again, kinds of behaviors and thought. When I say it's involved in those higher cognitive functions, these days it's often being called executive function. So these executive function tasks, or EF tasks, they talk about this as being pretty, so one of my jobs was at Landmark College Institute for Research and Training, where Landmark College is a college for students who learn differently. So people who have a learning disability, they get an associate's degree there, they learn to find their accommodations and figure out what they need in order to succeed in college. And then they can move on from there. But these executive function tasks can be difficult for a lot of people with a bunch of different learning disabilities. And we're also going to see some of these regions of the prefrontal cortex being less active in people with schizophrenia and with depression and all kinds of things. So it's important to kind of think of, it's again one of those really large brain regions, and so we'll talk about the medial, the lateral, the dorsolateral, all of that. Okay, so I want you to as we talk about and think about what are these executive function tasks, what am I talking about with the prefrontal cortex? Well, one good example, I think, is the Stroop task. And I'm going to do this demo. I usually do this demo in class with a single student, and we all kind of, just one person gets to experience this, and then everybody else is kind of, so what did you notice about this person's experience? And then the person tells us about their experience. But in this case, because you're home and you're all doing this with a computer or whatever your device, you can each do this. So just plan to go through this demo, what you're going to do, and I'm going to leave some silences, but you might want to just pause the video so that you give yourself time. I'm going to call it read, but go from left to right as if you're reading and name the color. Okay, start with the top left and go from left to right. Name the color of the item, of the object. Okay, so I'm doing it too, and I just went through pretty fast, but I've seen this many, many times. Again, I hope maybe you paused it. Now you're going to do the same thing. On the next slide, you're going to name the color of the font. Okay, you want to name the color of the font. Okay, and so if you think about your experience with that, again, hopefully you paused it if you needed the time, because I'm going to start talking now. If you realize your experience with that even if you could do it pretty well, which I actually usually make a mistake or two. I usually have a student who doesn't make any mistakes, and there's this noticeable slowdown, right? And what you could probably tell that is happening with you is that you want to say the color that's in writing, so that you want to say yellow, red, blue. You want to just read that. Originally, this was taken as evidence that reading is automatic, that we cannot not read if a basic word is in front of us. But now they use this as an executive function task and measure. And if you're getting diagnosed with something like ADHD, or they're seeing if you have ADHD, they might run you in this kind of Stroop task as what's happening when you are inhibiting that automatic response of saying the color name, so the word. You are using your dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and this prefrontal cortex is particularly damaged in people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So that's why it runs in my family, and that's why I have this. I actually usually make a mistake or two, and I've even seen this many times. I have a really hard time finding a way to just see the color. Some of my students say I can look at a certain place and just see the color and not be bothered by the word at all. But for me, I feel this definite, I have to inhibit the wrong response, and sometimes I go ahead and say it, and then I have to go back. Some of what we know about the damage to the prefrontal cortex has come from these case studies, and there's a newer person, I can't think of his name. I think they give him an initial, but it's Antonio Damasio who's doing a lot of work with him, and he has this same kind of damage. But a lot of times we talk about Phineas Gage, even though to some extent this is long ago enough, and there have been enough stories that it might be difficult to tell exactly how much of this is true. But from what we know, so what I'm saying is I'm pretty sure before all of the kind of legendary exaggerations got added to this. So what happened to Phineas Gage, and this was back in, I want to say the 1920s, but it might have been even a bit earlier. He was doing something at a rail yard, tamping something down with a tamping iron, and it exploded and sent that tamping iron, you can see, up through his left cheek and through the medial part, so that very center part of his prefrontal cortex. And while before this happened, I want to say he was one of the managers. He had a pretty high level job that had a lot of responsibility. He was clearly a conscientious and a responsible person. That after this happened, he could not have that. He could not hold that job anymore. And this quote is from one of his doctors, who says, "The balance between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seems to have been destroyed. He is fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires, a child in his intellectual capacity and manifestations." So a lot of that impulse control and controlling emotions, that was really damaged going through that medial part of when there's damage to that medial part of the prefrontal cortex. Wish I could think of the guy's name, but Antonio Damasio's patient, he had a cyst or a tumor that grew behind his eyes. And so in that same, you can almost see in that same kind of area, that part of the brain was damaged. And we will talk about him when we talk about emotional processing, because some of this emotional processing is important for, it gives us those somatic markers. So when I do something that's hurtful, I feel guilty. When I think about the future and I think of negative consequences, it has this kind of, I don't want to, I feel like I don't want to do that. And that's a somatic marker that he's just lacking. Okay, I've gone a little bit over again on Friday, and I will pay that back to you on next Wednesday. Will be that's usually how I plan to do this when I want to finish my the neuroanatomy. I wanted to finish this. Okay. You all take care. Have a great weekend. Stay safe.